Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Did you all go to the PASEO? Everybody raise your hand if you went to the PASEO. All right. So this is well, everybody knows what the PASEO is, but what we've added this year is this daytime. And so a little bit about the new daytime activity is that we wanted to add some lectures, roundtable discussions, and artist workshops for adults to answer the question of what is this kind of art and where does it come from, and what is the background on the thinking behind this kind of festival. And so that's why we added this, and we're trying it out to see how it goes. And this is one of the presentations that we have today. And who we have is Anita McKeown. And Anita McKeown was one of the first founding members of the PASEO. In the year one, we had a team of 5 people that developed the core ethics and the mission. She even came up with the name. And so we really appreciate our founding members. So, and then in this year, she was a juror for the PASEO. But she also, in her own right, is an amazing person that has done a PhD on creative placemaking and with permaculture. And that's what she's going to talk to you about. I'm not even going to attempt it. That's what I wish I could be here. But she is going to share with you her years of research on this a very fascinating topic. So without further ado, Anita McKeown. And she's also a great friend.
Thank you. Thank you. So of course I want to thank Matt and Agnes and all the PASEO team for bringing me here, but also making PASEO happen. It's a huge achievement. I was struck the other day when I was thinking, they say it takes a village to raise a child, and I think PASEO is a little bit like that. It wouldn't happen without all the input from the whole town and beyond. So what I'm going to do today, hopefully, is talk a little bit about, give some context to creative placemaking, because from 2009, it actually became a strategic federal activity. So while we may have an understanding of those two words, there's a very different understanding that is going on at government level. And I think it's really important to look at that so that we can begin to speak back and morph that in a way that's maybe a bit more equitable, I think is the word. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about that. We've some storytelling about my personal practice, and hopefully when I come to the tools, sort of try and use PASEO as a bit of an example of how the toolkit that I developed might work. But I just want to take a bit of a straw poll and see if anyone is willing to say what they think those two words, creative placemaking, mean. There's no right or wrong. I'm just interested to hear what people may. Yeah?
For me, first of all, it's listening to the place, what's there, is it, water, present, trees, native food plants, whatever's there, and then what's around it, what's already existing.
Yeah.
And then from that, for the people to come in and say, well, maybe this would be a good place for a kids' park or something, and put in a few structures for fruit trees and add to what's existing, but it's a co-creative thing, really, to me, listening to the nature first. Yeah. What wants to be there.
I'll pay you
Instead
later.
of using will, and we're going to make this a thing.
Absolutely. I was just saying I'll pay you later. That was like a perfect plant. Anyone else want to offer anything? You don't have to. It was just, I think one of the things I see is there's what we may understand on an everyday level of creative placemaking, and then there's this professionalization of it. So I just want to, did you want to say something, Jenna?
It seems to, I think of it in terms of an evolution. I think of it in terms of the evolution of a city and how a city can degenerate and businesses leave and spaces are empty, and then artists are like the, what comes in and revives a situation. So artists come into Soho. When I lived in New York, you could get a place really cheap in the early 70s, and now the same place, would be many thousands of dollars a month. And that's a cycle. It just keeps going in the urban, and that artists and the creative spirit is what revives something.
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that comes in the later section, but it is a tricky dance as an artist not to become part of the problem. And that's something that really stood out for me within permaculture, because a central tenet of permaculture is the solution is in the problem. It's not necessarily out there. So I'm just going to... I want to give a little bit of background just to this professionalization or this government backstory. So in 2009, Rocco Landesman, who was a Broadway theatre producer, became the chair of the National Endowment of the Arts. And he really implemented strategic placemaking as a US strategic policy platform. It has quite a distinct heritage, which I think is important to know. Do many people know Richard Florida's creative class? Okay, so basically, it was a piece of research done by a social scientist at Carnegie Mellon, and very quickly, cities all over the world adopted it as like a panacea to the post-industrial landscape. You know, cities were going through a change, as Janet mentioned, that cycle, and they started to see this idea of the creative class as this could be revitalizing. And it came with a lot of problems. And something I think it's important to know, Richard Florida's focus group was actually 100 MBA students. So suddenly, maybe not quite the idea of a creative class that we might think about. Maybe they might have different needs and wants and desires of a place. And that very much set a bit of a tone, you know, and that, I remember at the time, that went through, certainly in Europe and part of the US, it was like wildfire. You know, people saw it as an answer. And so when creative placemaking started emerging, I could see that again. I could see people starting to go, oh, maybe this is the thing, you know, and there's no one thing. There's no real formula. That's the thing I really want to kind of talk about today. Now, the next phase of creative placemaking's evolution was, at the time, a woman called Joan Shigagawa, who was actually the director of the Foundations Initiatives at the Rockefeller Institute, paired these two organizations. The SciAP, which is the Social Impact of the Arts Project, which is a research project at State Penn. They've done some great work. They've been going for a long time. And the Reinvestment Fund, which was a community development fund. And they started asking each other these different questions. You know, what can a community development do for the arts? What can the arts do for community development? Out of that, this culture and community revitalization came. And they started, State Penn, with others around the world, started talking about this idea of a cultural ecology. So they're starting to talk much more systemically and look at a whole rather than a siloed position. Out of that, the interesting part for our story is Joan Shigagawa became Rocco Landesman's deputy chair at the NEA, round about the time he was looking and taking a survey of the arts in America. And he then commissioned Anne Markison, who's a real veteran of arts economic impact and relationship, and a woman called Anne Gadwa Nicodemus to develop a white paper, basically. And Anne Gadwa she was a dancer, then she was a choreographer, turned planner, turned research consultant. So that was the kind of people who were starting to look at what might this... So it was almost like the name happened first, then there was a bit of a look into what was actually going on, and then out of that they wrote the white paper that began to set the tone for what creative placemaking would be. Now, I think we can all understand that formally and informally, placemaking, creative placemaking is happening every day on multiple levels. But I want to talk a little bit more about the strategic platform, because there's certain aspects within it. Part of my doctorate was looking at, I did an audit of every project funded by the NEA and ArtPlace between 2010 and 2015. It was over 400 projects. And I'll talk a little bit about what came out from that audit. But before I go into that, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think is important to acknowledge as a practitioner. It came up yesterday in the STEAM session. Much of our identities as practitioners how do they shape our practice? And I think one of the things, I see place and people as a very intersubjective relationship. It is, it's integrated. And while, we're involved in placemaking, I think places and policies and having a place in the world also forms and shapes us too. So it's more like a conversation. Listening and seeing place is something that I talk about in the example I tried to develop. And some of it was based on personal as well as professional. So I'm just going to show a few examples of personal and professional experiences. And I'm now going to go into a slightly different mode. Belfast, 1970, coordinates 54 degrees north, 5.9 degrees west. Balfirsti, mouth of the sandbar, Linnanopolis, was a complicated place. A troubled situation, some might say. Place, a particular position or point in space. Complicated, consisting of many interconnecting parts or elements. Intricate, involving many different and confusing aspects. A troubled situation, a difficult set of circumstances in which one finds oneself. A state of affairs. A troubled location and its surrounding of place. Arrival, 3rd of October 1970, 5:30 p.m, girl, weight 7 pounds 10 ounces. Belfast Jubilee Maternity Hospital, 274 Grosvenor Road, Belfast, BT12 6BA. Mother, 43 years, Salvation Army Methodist, Alliance Party. Father, 46 years, atheist, Social Democratic Labour Party. Belfast, 292,848 citizens, self-defined as Protestants. Majority, Democratic Unionist Party. 115,259 citizens, self-defined as Catholic. Majority, Sinn Féin. 2,984 citizens, self-defined as undefined. Total population, including this new arrival, 411,091 citizens. And I use that just to start to set the context of this was a place that was divided. You were told what school you went to based on your religion. There was separations and how you had to navigate the city. And that was one of my earliest, I guess that context became one of my earliest understandings of how place is made, and it's not always positive. There's negative placemaking that happens as well, and it's something we need to be mindful of. Green Island, 1984, coordinates 54.6 degrees north, 5.85 degrees west. Best friend, Catholic, attending Fort William Dominican College, a grammar school at 38 Fort William Park, Belfast. I, Protestant, ish, kinda, attending Belfast High School, a grammar school at 740 Shore Road, Newton Abbey. She, harassed, bullied by pupils, Protestant spies, direct lineage of the Rathcoole Kai, kill all Irish, attending Hopefield Secondary School at Rathcoole Drive, White House, Newton Abbey. The upshot is she no longer waits for me at the bus stop, the one location we all share, so we can walk home together. Why? Why do I not see things the way they see them? Why can't they see what I see? Oh, slides got shifted. Okay. Sorry about that. Art at the Art of Change, 2000 to 2006. Coordinates, 51 degrees north, 0.0083 degrees east. It's very close to Greenwich Mean Time. Art at the Art of Change was a legacy of the Art of Change, a public arts organisation focusing on change in the domains of art, regeneration, technology and the environment. I was the project manager of commissioned art projects, including project development. Previously known as the Docklands Community Poster Project, the organisation provided tenants and action groups a voice during the redevelopment of the London Docklands. In 2001, the DCCP evolved into a public art cooperative, working within regeneration projects. Consistently, tensions arose between commissioner and developers' agendas, timelines, budgets versus the actual work required to develop an understanding of place and include residents and their concerns within the process of regeneration. Why is it if they want a holistic process, do they compromise the work required to do it? Why as artists are we selected for our process and then constrained? Why do I not see things the way they see them? Why can't they see what I see? Memphis, Tennessee, USA, 2005. Coordinates 35 degrees north, 89 degrees west. Urban Art Commission, Artist in Residence for Bravo Award. Memphis 45s was the title of a public art commission created to challenge prevailing public art practice and the perception of the city, both by residents and visitors. Residents were asked face-to-face and in articles and adverts in local papers, what is your sound of Memphis? The signed locations were recorded and the audio and video separated and remixed to develop a psychogeographic portrait of the city that represented local understandings of place, filtered through the lens of the artist's camera and experience. Now, when I went to Memphis, the consistent question I was asked was, what are you doing here? This place is a shithole. And I was kind of like, have you looked lately? You know, to me as an outsider, and this I think is a valuable role of the outsider artist, to me as an outsider, I was thinking, wow, you can't fall over. You know, you go around a corner and you're falling over a piece of popular culture, musical heritage, and really important heritage in relation to African-American culture. And I just couldn't understand. And then I thought about it and I thought, yeah, I've stopped looking in my place too. You know, familiarity breeds contempt. And so they'd started to, I was getting a feeling that people were starting to, you know, or not starting to, but would often focus on the negative and had maybe stopped looking because we're so busy, you know, trying to go to work, trying to feed children or going to school or whatever it is. We don't look, we maybe forget what's valuable. And sometimes an outside eye going, have you seen this? This is amazing. So I think part of my sort of MO really in what I set out to try and develop within creative placemaking was a way that could maybe encourage people to fall in love again with the place that they lived, a sort of an intimacy with place. And that's very much part of how the projects evolved. Now they're very much what I talk about in terms of situated practice. So situated practices don't really have a fixed form. They emerge out of the situation or the context in which they're developed. And one of the things that I noticed in my practice and in other people's practice, you know, this idea of parachuting an artist in. And this came up with the art of change. You know, you might get 3 months. You're parachuted in and you're expected to produce something at the end. And I just didn't really see that as a very useful process for anybody. And actually, back to that idea of where the artist could actually become part of the problem. It's very easy to not understand a place if you only see a superficial vision of it. So I set out to see if there was a way that I could develop a framework or a support tool, really, that constantly reminded you of different aspects of place. And so one of the things, just wrapping up the personal and professional, from the outset, I could be considered as somewhat out of place, an inherited religious political displacement from a place constructed through politics and religion, a place increasingly remade through segregation that sustained a dominant narrative. From this perspective, a fixed position does not necessarily seem to offer the best solution for maximizing potential. Indeed, it could be said that fixed positions and domination of one position over another is the root of the problem. One possibility, the problem is the solution, or perhaps more clearly articulated as the solution lies within the problem, offered an interesting avenue for inquiry. But what was the problem exactly? If we are unsure of the problem, then a fixed position is certainly not the answer. Perhaps an itinerant approach, an agile problem finder. Displacement becomes an elective, a way to reveal the unfamiliar of the everyday, to locate the problem, a useful modus operandi for creative placemaking and remaking. Displacement as a meaningful way to negotiate nomadically the in-between, and perhaps in this space-place, explore the dynamic in-between of self and other, fact and fiction, personal and political. Using an imaginative response to problem finding, we might just start to find our way home, wherever that may be. So that was a very personal and professional context that really influenced the process that I went on to develop, as well as the research from the audit. I mentioned I audited all the projects between 2010 and 2015, and it showed the majority had been the development of artist-led workspaces, cultural quarters, cultural planning, monumental public art projects, or design enhancements with some programming and some artist residencies. And what I think is important about that is just to go back to the strategic platform. There's two key organizations, National Endowment for the Arts and Art Place, and they're supported by 14 of the largest philanthropic organizations in America. So Kresge, McKnight, Rockefeller. 8 federal agencies and 6 national banks. So this is a huge strategic effort. And if they're setting an agenda that is all about capital spend, then I felt there was some problems with that. And I felt there was so much more involved in the arts and what the arts could bring to creative placemaking. So it was developed in 3 case studies, and Taos played a really big part in it. Because the first one, I knew this area very well. I'd lived there for 18 years, and so I used the beginnings of the toolkit to see, did it help me see an area very differently? And then the second residency in Taos, which was kind of became an extended residency over 3 years. It was the first time really that I'd started to test the toolkit in a place I knew nothing about, but also had quite a distinct identity in terms of the arts, environmental and innovative experimentation within environmental technology. And the final one was Dublin within a third-level education institution, which on the one hand was a research-intensive university with a widening participation agenda. And those two things were almost like an oxymoron. They didn't really communicate. The research they were interested in was hardcore science, and anything else really wasn't, you know. So I chose these very specifically because I wanted to make sure that whatever was developed was transferable, was totally adaptive. So these were very specific geopolitical situations that helped really start to work through this process. Added to this, you know, I'm talking about situated practice. There is a big situation in the world at the moment. Some of us may have, you know, not noticed, but we are really looking at some huge challenges. One of my other research interests is the environmental and social impact of technology. And through that, I've been looking a lot at our materiality and how that impacts on us, as well as just general issues around climate change and the you know, food and water. So planetary urbanization, that's just basically saying that there's a dominant lifestyle, whether we live in a rural, a suburban, or an urban area. Now, we all know that there are differences, but in terms of connectivity and a certain type of way of being in the world and certain values are becoming more and more dominant. Anthropocentric climate change. When I started doing the research, they were talking about if there was such a thing as anthropocentric climate change. And 3 weeks ago, not only have they said there is, they fixed the date, which is they're looking at around the 1950s. As they're monitoring across a system, they can see that's when all the impacts, you know, started to really spike. They were looking at colonization of America as one point. They were also looking at the industrial revolution, but neither of those has caused the impact that they're now saying has happened from the 50s onwards. So they were just some other instances that I wanted to address, because in this audit that I was doing, out of 12 key creative placemakers, not one definition mentioned anything overtly environmental. So that to me, again, was another something that I felt strongly needed to be considered. I wanted it to be open source. I wanted anybody, whatever was developed, anybody could use it. And so that became a very particular area that I started looking at. One of the things that happens in regeneration is this sort of bipolar, top down, bottom up. And I was like, I think I'm more interested in the inside out, this situation, what is coming out of. Local people are the experts. There's multiple knowledge, there's multiple assets available. That really should be contributing to the evolution of that place, you know, not these sort of external. Now, we can't live in a void, I'm aware of that, but I really wanted to develop a process that allowed for that knowledge to be folded in. It also allows for whoever's using it, whatever their practice is, whatever their profession is, they can also adapt it to their needs. It's not specific to art, even though that's what I kind of developed it for. Resilience, quite simply, is the ability to adapt well to change. And I really felt that resilience existed in every community anyway. It wasn't something that you had to encourage new, but maybe we could support it and enhance it. For me, resilience isn't a passive, kind of stoic position. It's actually a very dynamic, creative, active approach. So this is just a very quick overview. Permaculture, most people know permaculture for growing food, but actually it's an ecological design system. So it has been used to look at, I mean, there was the Permaculture Credit Union in New Mexico. It's also been used to look at relationships. And I think for me, when I did my permaculture training, I was kind of saying, wow, this is really, there's loads in here I could use in my artistic practice as a way to begin to kind of understand a location. This is just basically very briefly a transition through the research. Their original definition included these 4 characteristics. And through what I was trying to do, develop a systemic approach, a tactical approach, open source, and situated arts, they morphed into what becomes the vital signs of an evaluation matrix at the end, which I'll talk a little bit about. So one of the backbone tools of permaculture is this mnemonic: observation, boundaries, resources, evaluation, design, implementation, and maintenance. As I was working with the tools, I realized that following this, it became a great way to start to see a system, a localized system. It was also a great opportunity to start listening. I talk about the process as listening and seeing place. Ideally, you do nothing until you've completed phase 1, which I'll talk about in a little while, because it's all about observation and getting to find out what exactly exists. And that was one of the problems with these parachuting artists in. They're just getting to the end of maybe the 3 months, and they're only beginning to get some kind of sense of understanding about the place. So I found that that was really important to help to start feeding that in, to see if we could develop a reciprocal process of sharing and listening before we actually start to manifest anything. What I've noticed that seems to help to do is it shows you vulnerabilities in the system, or weak spots, or spots that with a little tweak, information maybe could flow much better, or partnerships could develop, or there's 4 people working in the same field and they're not talking to each other. You know, that's the sort of information the system starts to give. And I find also as well that because of the way that you build the project, it's very generative. It's building in constantly through the idea of implementation and maintenance. As an artist, you're building in your exit strategy from the beginning through this system, because you're part of the process of the project that is built is about connecting and making new networks. And so the idea would be is you make yourself redundant, you know. That's not to say that every place needs an artist, but if an artist is being invited in to look at a problem, this became a very useful tool to help to try and do that more sensitively and more ethically, really. one of the things the projects tend to do is they open up these other spaces where other things can happen. Now, in an art speak, that would be the aesthetic third, this third space where you can actually, multiple cultures, multiple identities can all be included and collaboratively reimagine or begin to re-understand themselves differently. So this is just an example of one of the logs that I developed. It looks really complex and really technical, but again, the whole toolkit is developed as a support system to help people when they're in chaos, really, have a bit of a stable foundation. And because the ethics are built into it, it actually minimizes that idea of the artist being the problem. So you can see just the original permaculture would be much more related to the physical world. So wind direction, growth patterns, tracking the sun, where you are in relation to the sun. And I started to expand them out. One of the things I noticed, if you're doing a residency and you arrive, you'll often get an induction pack. And in that induction pack is what the people who've invited you in decide is important for you to know. That can be really useful, but it also can set a boundary around your exploration. So this was a way that artists could begin their own itinerant journey that was supported. What time is it? Just out of, I decide whether to read. Okay, I'm gonna jump on through. So another aspect is the zoning, and you can see the original coming back to that idea of the growing food, and then I adapted it out. And this is totally depending on your project. Zone 0 is always your project. So whatever your project is, you fill in the other zones in relation to what your project is. So depending on where you're located, so it could be really micro, or it could be sort of local, national, international. This is how, this is just a little way of starting to map your project. So the first stage was building a microecology. Now, this isn't rocket science, we all do this, but again, this was just to remind us that we should be, if we're coming into a new location, it's to find out what already exists, and the best people that will know that are the people who are already there. There's often a lot of individuals and organizations working together who maybe because of their agendas, they can't really fully partner, but if you create this other space where their shared priorities can be enacted, that can actually be a way to start developing this idea of a microecology. Sometimes it also, with that slight reframing, it can give the two organizations or other partners a different way of looking at themselves. Going back to like SIAP and the RTF, they started asking questions of each other because they were different that made them reconsider what they actually did themselves. This is also part of the way where it does two purposes. It folds in that local knowledge, but it also provides a check and a balance, and it starts to give a more nuanced reading of the location, rather than an artist going, oh, I saw this thing, and A plus B equals C. It gives you where you can check in and go, no, that's not quite how it works. You know, so it just, again, it's this supportive toolkit that was really trying to get away from that sort of plop art, you know, and the sometimes what can happen with the parachuting. So this was just a very quick, what PASEO might look like. I mean, this is just a snapshot. There's so much more on the partnership with PASEO. But one of the things the zoning helps you do is, because it's 1 to 0 and it's done in the proximity to your project, and in terms of maybe a more environmental aspect, if all your activity is out in zone 5, you've got a bit of a problem, because you're having to travel everything, all the energy, all the conversations, if it's materials, and I'll talk about that in a minute, across back to the project, and that might not be the best use of resources. So one of the things when you're using the zoning method at the beginning of your project, you can use it as a developmental tool. You know, when you have an idea in your head, you can start really visualizing that and see it quite relationally. And that's quite a useful, particularly when you're somewhere you don't know. It's not moving forward. There we go. So again, the mapping, the strategic intervention tactic, politics in place, you can't get away from them. You really need to know, as a professional, you really need to know what are the bigger agendas that you're actually working within, or maybe even against. It really, depends on the project, and you can start to see how there's all these multiple layers. Some will have really immediate impact, some of them may not. I know, for example, with a project I did here, the Ice Cream Olympics, and also with one in PASEO, Raspao, they're having to engage with the Department of Environment to get licensing because there's food involved in this project. One of the things that worked for me, I had a meeting with them and they were talking about all sorts of kitchens because milk is considered a dangerous material. And I'm thinking, oh, how am I going to get people to bring their own ingredients and we're going to be in a field and we're going to make ice cream to play games with? That doesn't really fit in with that very strict. So in our conversations, they give me the policy, and as I was reading it, I was thinking, potlucks. So when I went back to them and said, if we did this as a potluck, do I need a temporary food license? And they went, not at all. But that was because I was able to have the conversation with them. I was able to understand what their concerns were, and then also through the local context, find out where there was stuff happening that I could build the bridge between the two activities. And that becomes a really useful tool for an artist working in a location, for anybody really, if you're trying to get something through. I'm sure we've all come across situations where you come up against a regulation or something that blocks. Coming back to the microecology, if you have a good relationship with your partners, you can begin to say, okay, what really is the obstacle? And how can we use both our knowledges to make it not an obstacle anymore? So that's very much part of what the toolkit really helps. I think the button's broken. Maybe it's telling me I should shut up. Okay. So again, this was just a very quick, almost off the top of my head, the things that might be applying to PASEO, the strategic policies that could also be very useful, that you can use to leverage activities that you might need to do, that you can use to begin to talk to people to say, hey, this has value, and this is why. I can translate this in to the language that you may understand. It doesn't compromise what you're trying to do. It just begins to create this shared language in this space of communication. And coming back to the idea of a life cycle analysis, again, you can use the zoning to start looking at all the different aspects of your project. And this is very important if you're trying to build in environmental justice, even social justice, because, for example, within materials and equipment, where are they from? Who's making them? How did you get them here? And it's not about, oh, you haven't done very well on your project. It can be an aspirational tool. You can begin to part that as part of your longer term strategic plan. In X years' time, we'd really like to be here. But if you don't start looking at it and knowing what it is you'd like to morph as you travel, that can be very difficult with those plans. So just quickly, you can see this would be your inputs, and as I said, you can start mapping them and really start to make decisions, very useful for deciding where you might get your materials or what materials are coming in. Knowledge is power. If we're informed, we can start to make different decisions. And the same just goes for the processes and the outputs. So this is another part of permaculture, Earth Care, People Care, Fair Share. I really like this. People often talk about the triple bottom line, or the social, the environmental, and the economic. I actually think this is just much more accessible. We can really understand what these measures are, and if we use them in conjunction with the 4 principles, the microecologies, strategic interventions, reseeding local knowledge, and resituating arts and culture, you can actually build up a matrix that begins, again, can be used as a developmental tool, You can decide what it is you're hoping to achieve across these. Oh, yeah, it's cut out the building of microecologies. Or you can use it as an evaluation tool. And the reason I developed this as part of the project was often you're evaluated against scientific or social science paradigms. They're totally irrelevant. We're not working in a lab. We have so many variables that it's very difficult to pinpoint what the impact was. If you're working in a complex adaptive situation like place, you can't really say, oh, it was that thing that did that thing that did that. So I was thinking, well, why should we even bother? Why not start to look at relational evaluation and see what we can actually build in? So again, it's very much specific to your project. You start to set your parameters of what you're hoping will be success. And these are just very generic. This was just to give an idea of what might be part of what your bits in your matrix would be. One of the things when I did the Ice Cream Olympics, this is quite an interesting one, new policies or operational procedures. John Bailey, the monument manager, he had said to himself, you know, leisure or monument public lands, it's all about hiking and biking. That was how he looked at it. That was how he assessed in terms of doing his job. And after we did the Ice Cream Olympics, we were conversing about, you know, what did you think of it? And, you know, first of all, he said it wasn't art. Then he told me, I asked him what was art, and then he told me what he thought it was. And then I said, well, is that not what the Ice Cream Olympics was? And he said, yeah, now I think about it. He says, it's made me really think about the role that arts could play within public lands. There's so much more engagement that we could be doing. So it's making me reconsider how I can do my job. And that was really important to me because part of what we'd done together in promoting and developing the foundation of the Ice Cream Olympics was we'd gone to the county fair for 2 days. And I had made all these taster ice creams, like I did pinto bean and vanilla. I did red chili and agave. I did choke cherry. I did a Santa Fe Java Stout, because it was really trying to, that was a food sovereignty project, so it was looking at what is local, what can we remix, how can we redefine, how can we start seeing things differently than the way we think. The BLM had never been to the county fair. That to me was astonishing. You know, they give land every year at a nominal rate to ranchers. You know, to me, that was a big part, that was part of their constituents, and they'd never been. So that kind of feeds in nicely where you have this other thing that can happen that provokes new questions or new relationships. And I think, these were very patient, I think that's where I'm going to stop. I'm aware it's quite technical. You know, it's very systems orientated. But if anyone has any questions or wants to ask about projects or anything, I think we've got some time. I think we've got about 15 minutes, maybe.
What's your observation about how PASEO is going to affect the place that is Taos?
I think there's multiple levels. I think one of the things within later iterations of the projects that were funded by the creative placemaking organizations was festivals. And they were often this kind of very corporate or very top-down, one and done. And I think where PASEO's strength is it's integrating on multiple levels, both from different, you know, whether it's the town and the more legislative or official levels, the police department, the fire department, all the volunteers, all the schools. I mean, I think that makes it really different. I think one of the biggest things, and I've seen this in other projects in Europe, I think one of the biggest things we can give to the next generation is that they begin to understand that they can change their world. Now, I'm not saying that art on its own is going to change the world. It's not. We're at a point now where no single field can change the world. It's got to be interdisciplinary. We've got to work together. But I think what things that happen in the PASEO do, particularly for young people, is, oh, suddenly the roads are closed. Suddenly people are walking all over the place. People are talking, people are communicating. I think on a deep level, it gives them something inside that says, my town can be different, and people from my town can make it different. And so I think for me, that will be one of the longer legacies out of PASEO. I think all the education work as well, you know, sort of, I think one of the things I find, you know, coming out of Belfast and going to college, all the art around me was white male. And I think one of the things that's really important is within PASEO that young people start to see that they are represented within that profession, which suddenly you think, I could do that. That's something for me. You know, whereas maybe before it would have been, oh, you know, you wouldn't even consider it. I think also because it's showing different types of art. I mean, I think one of the things I find very frustrating with creative placemaking and how, when I did the audit, it was almost like they weren't really engaging with the almost half a century of practices that were looking at working with community, social practice, weren't working with object-orientated processes. And I think that's really important as well. I think PASEO does that really well. So that's just a few. Going on from that, you can track back economics, but it just takes longer. I think things like that are more durational, and that's one of the things that's frustrating. A lot of the evaluations that happen in the arts are all about immediacy. And Anne Markison talks about this because she's saying actually within the science world, they don't have to prove as early as we think they do. You know, and it's suddenly like, oh, we have to show impact, we have to show numbers, we have to show, and it's like, maybe we need to take a longer viewpoint. Because with intervention, you may not see, it could be 10 years before the impact is there, and you might never know about it. Because it could have been, you know, one child saw something that made them think differently, or took a class that they went, wow, I want to do programming, or I want to be involved in the environmental, you know, and that's where I started to develop this, because it became back to the situation of the project, because a lot of the evaluation, you just can't track unless you're going to track every single person that interacts with PASEO over 20 years. You're not going to get, you know, so I guess it's about also reframing, you know, reframing on PASEO's terms, what it wants to achieve and what it hopes for, and building that in to its processes. And I think that's what the toolkit is, part of that's what it hopes to do. You know, it constantly gives us a kind of little, oh, you know, provocations. Hi.
Hi. I've been involved with the Taos youth leadership. Have you guys heard about this? Good.
Yeah.
So to me, the PASEO, as far as any established group of people in Taos, is like the best place that I could see. Fueling, supporting, and allowing youth to do what they want. And the other piece to this is a place. So I've heard Ray's, I don't know the full name of it, but there's a warehouse in Santa Fe that supports young people where they can go and be and do what they want. One of your slides that I'd love to show the kids that I know that are involved in this is your bottom up, inside out. To me, that's the definition of grassroots. It's, anyway, I don't know if anybody in here else has a comment about how we can support young people really anchoring a place that's really co-creative and empowering. But yeah, I just see a lot of your work fitting into where we need to go from here. So thank you so much, and I'm really grateful I could be here today.
Thank you. It's very, very generous, and it's very nice to hear. I mean, I'm here at the moment to start a project with the Beautiful Midden. Do you know Beautiful Midden? And one of the things we're going to try, because it's very short, we've only got 6 weeks, is we're going to try and open up a drop-in for a cohort for young sort of people to come in and start to learn the system. Also hoping to get some older artists that can support them, so that when I'm not here, you know, this idea of making myself redundant. And then we're actually trying to fundraise through that project at the moment for a year-long project to start next year that we hope would give a much more solid manifestation of that, that would create a space where young people can, for me, I'm a citizen as well as an artist, and I don't see a distinct art is only this and citizenship is only that. And I think this idea of a third space, this in-between that sort of exists in two parts, can begin to form those places. A lot of the organizations that I've worked with in Europe, they have youth councils, and slowly, again, it's this redundancy idea, slowly they're supported to take over the organization and running. And one of the points of this process was to try and build a foundation for self-organization. So I'm hoping that out of that short-term process and then the much longer one, that those conversations can start to happen of a more physical, more permanent space. I mean, the town of Taos is going to support we're putting in the grant tomorrow. They're going to support the longer term. They're giving kind of demo sites where the young people can apply their knowledge that they've learned to test, to make interventions. There's 5 at the moment. They're difficult sites. I won't say they're not. And they're almost picked to help really bring forward that issue of the environment and social justice and what have you. So maybe we can talk afterwards and see how, we can work together on that. That would be really great for me. I'd love that. Thank you.
I'm curious about, have you given this toolkit to other artists to take to other places, and how have they seen it be successful? How have they played with it?
Yeah, I mean, not yet, because it was only completed at the end of last year. And at the moment, you can see the logs and the drawings. It's not fully accessible. I feel it needs to be kind of a nice little graphic something or other that's dead easy. But that's what I want to do, because to me, this was just the beginning. And I know that other people using it and really pushing it hard will actually make it develop. So that's are you an artist? I am. Would you like to use it? Sure. Cool. That's great. All I would ask is that you let me know how you get on with it and what works and what doesn't. And, because what I want to build longer term is an accessible platform that anyone can use. I'm trying to look at funding for that, because I feel to do that it would take much more skills than I've got. I feel I need a graphic designer. I need lots of, that's sort of the next stage. And I also want to align it to the International Declaration of Human Rights. That will be its licensing. So that, you can use it, but you can't use it for military, you can't use it for war, you can't use it if it's going to screw something up. Hard to police, but at least if it's in place, then...
Yeah, I have the play studio up in El Prado, and I have a residency program. And
okay.
I was actually talking to a friend this morning about the difficulties of bringing somebody in to a new situation and having them have all this energy and be so excited and then start changing things without knowing what they're doing.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah,
well, I'll get your details, because it would be great. I could compile something a bit more, easily to read or whatever, and you could give that to those artists or, use it yourself. That would be great. Anybody else as well that wants to use it? I mean, it was built to be open source,
Yeah, I've just changed my residency to be 2 years, so they've got time to play.
Yeah. That's brilliant to hear, because that was one of the things that I found, even with the creative play, when I did the audit, even the creative placemaking residencies were very short. And often, maybe the artist might only come once or twice, and then go away and make work, and then come back again. The project, like the Ice Cream Olympics, I mean, I first came to Taos in 2010. I first pitched the process after working with the Youth and Family Centre and the Art Garden Centre, because it became apparent to me that there was a bit of a food issue in New Mexico. And so I looked to see how could how could I build a project? So I was here for 3 months, did a lot of groundwork, then pitched the project to the Youth and Family Centre. And then it didn't actually happen until September 2013. That was 3 years to make the project happen. And then on the other side of the project, that making yourself redundant, I continued to work with LEAP, an organization in Cuesta, and work a lot with Claire on fundraising and development. And slowly over the years, like this year, I wasn't involved at all in anything they did, and they formed a coalition now in Cuesta that involves the Park Service, the BLM, the town of Cuesta, the tourist board, and they're all now starting to work together. And myself and Claire have tracked that back to that project, which wasn't, you know, it wasn't about me, it was about what happened within the project. So that was really exciting, you know, that over the 3 years, it's like, oh, what's going on? So, thank you. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and I hope it wasn't such an onslaught to hear or, you know, pay attention to.